Paper is not supposed to sound like a gunshot. But when Officer Grant Kessler dug his thumb under the wax seal of a thick brown envelope and ripped it open in one violent motion, the sound cracked through the humid Baltimore night like a round fired into concrete. He thought he was humiliating a stranger. He did not know he was tearing open a federal warrant with his own name typed on the third page. 38 minutes later, armored trucks would seal every exit of his precinct. And Grant Kessler would understand, for the first time in his miserable career, what it felt like to be the one in the cage. The dashboard clock in Kessler's cruiser read 11:46 p.m. It was the kind of July night that made the asphalt on Route 14 shimmer under the streetlights, even after the sun had been gone for hours, the air thick enough that his uniform stuck to his back before he'd even stepped out of the car. He hated this stretch of road. He hated the graveyard shift. Most of all, he hated the particular ache of a man who believed he deserved a captain's bars and had been passed over twice, left instead, to patrol a forgotten corridor on the edge of the Ninth District with nothing to show for 11 years on the job but a bad knee and a worse attitude. A dented gray Honda Accord drifted a few inches over the center line and corrected. Its passenger taillight was cracked, throwing a jagged spray of white instead of red. Kessler's mouth curled. It wasn't a violation. It was an invitation. He flipped the light bar on and watched the red and blue wash over the dead grass on the shoulder, and the Honda eased over without hesitation, tires crunching softly on the gravel. He took his time getting out. He always did. Making people wait was its own kind of authority, cheap and free and endlessly satisfying. He walked up with his hand resting on his belt, and his flashlight aimed straight at the driver's mirror, a trick meant to blind and unsettle. The window was already down. The woman behind the wheel was black, somewhere in her late 30s, and utterly unbothered by the beam in her face. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, not a wrinkle in it, despite the heat, her hands resting at 10 and 2, steady as stone. There was no tremor in her voice when she spoke, no flicker of the fear Kessler was used to harvesting. License and registration, he said, letting his voice carry the flat contempt he saved, for people he'd already decided didn't matter. You were drifting, taillights busted. I wasn't drifting, officer, she said, and the taillight cracked 3 hours ago in a parking garage on Charles Street. There's an incident report filed with the garage security office if you'd like the number. I didn't ask for a story, he snapped, stepping closer, his shadow falling across her door. I asked for documents now. She reached, slow and deliberate, into the inside pocket of her blazer. Kessler's hand tightened on his holster. Hands where I can see them, he barked, and she paused just long enough to let him understand she was choosing to comply, not obeying out of fear. Then, with 2 fingers, she drew out a thick legal envelope and held it through the window. It was not a license. It was heavy cream-colored parchment, and stamped across the front, in blood-red ink, were the words United States, Department of Justice. Sealed by order of federal court, do not open, 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1519. The back was closed with a disc of dark red wax, pressed with the eagle seal of the federal government. Kessler let out a short, ugly laugh. "What is this?" he said, turning it over in his hands. "You one of those sovereign citizen types. Think a fancy stamp gets you out of a fix-it ticket." "Officer," she said, and something in her tone dropped an octave, filled the space between them with a weight that should have stopped him cold. "I am not required to produce civilian identification. That envelope is my authorization. I need you to return it to me, step back to your vehicle, and call your watch commander. Do not break that seal." "You don't give me orders," Kessler said, and his face flushed dark. The idea that this woman, sitting in a 10-year-old Honda on the side of a dead highway, thought she could instruct him was more insulting than any curse word could have been. Last chance. License, or I open the door myself. That envelope is my identification. she said quietly. "It is also the only warning you are going to get." He tore it open anyway, laughing while he did it, a wet, ripping sound that seemed too loud for the empty road. He yanked out a stack of watermarked pages and skimmed the first line without comprehending it. Federal seal, district judge's signature. The kind of paper that had never once crossed his desk in 11 years of parking tickets and noise complaints. The woman watched him without blinking. Her expression didn't move toward panic. It moved toward something colder. "Finality, Officer Kessler," she said, reading the nameplate on his chest. "You just committed a federal felony. Destruction of a sealed federal warrant and obstruction of a federal investigation." He should have stopped there. Some small, buried, functioning part of his brain screamed at him to stop there. Instead, his pride did what it always did. "Step out of the car," he said. "You're under arrest." "For what charge?" she asked, not moving an inch. "Failure to ID, resisting and producing forged documents," he said, already reaching in to grab her arm. She let him pull her out. She let him spin her against the side of the Honda and crank the cuffs tight around her wrists, and she did not so much as flinch when the metal bit into her skin. "You have no idea what you just set in motion," she whispered, so quiet the highway noise nearly swallowed it. "Save it for the judge," he said, shoving her into the back of his cruiser, and he never noticed the small green light blinking once, twice, 3 times on the collar pin of her blazer, sending a signal skyward, off a satellite, and down into a command post less than 30 blocks away. The Ninth District Station House was a squat brick building that smelled permanently of burnt coffee and old floor wax. The kind of precinct where careers went to die quietly, and nobody asked too many questions about who was making extra money on the side. Kessler marched his prisoner through the double doors, like a trophy, chest out, chin up, loud enough that every desk in the bullpen turned to look. Desk Sergeant Walt Pruitt, 31 years on the job, and a face like a roadmap of broken blood vessels, glanced up from his crossword. "What'd you drag in, Kessler? She don't look like your usual 2 a.m. special." "Sovereign citizen," Kessler announced to the room, tossing the envelope and its ripped pages onto Pruitt's desk like a hunting trophy. "Handed me a fake federal warrant wrapped in wax like it was the Ark of the Covenant. Refused to ID. Arrested her for obstruction." He walked the woman to holding cell 2, uncuffed her, and slammed the barred door with a clang that echoed off the cinder block. She didn't rub her wrists. She crossed to the bench, sat, crossed her legs, and looked at the clock on the far wall like she was waiting for a train. It read 12:19 a.m. Pruitt picked up the torn envelope. His thick fingers ran along the paper, and something in his face changed. This wasn't the cheap toner and copy paper garbage he usually confiscated off internet conspiracy types. This had weight, texture. He held the torn flap up to the fluorescent light overhead and saw embedded in the fiber of the paper itself a watermark of the Department of Justice seal, so fine it was almost invisible unless you knew to look. "Kessler," he said, and his voice had lost its lazy drawl. "Where exactly did she get this?" "She handed it to me like it was scripture," Kessler said, pouring himself coffee at the counter, not even bothering to turn around. "I ripped it right in front of her." Pruitt pulled the top sheet free with 2 fingers, like it might be hot. "United States District Court, District of Maryland for search, seizure, and arrest." His eyes dropped to the target line. Not a stash house, not a chop shop. The target was the Ninth District Precinct, Baltimore Police Department. Persons named for immediate detention: Captain Roy Faulkner, Officer Grant Kessler. All on-duty personnel. "Jesus," Pruitt breathed. "Kessler, you tore this open." "Yeah, so?" Kessler said, still not turning around, still not understanding the floor was already gone from under him. "It's not fake," a new voice said from the hallway, and Captain Roy Faulkner stepped out of his office, a lean, sharp-eyed man who had run the Ninth District for 6 years. Like it was his own private kingdom, one where the rules bent whichever way kept the money flowing. He crossed to the desk, snatched the pages from Pruitt's shaking hands, and read. By the time he finished the first paragraph, every trace of his usual arrogance had drained out of his face, replaced by something Kessler had never once seen on his captain. Fear. "Who is she?" Faulkner demanded, whipping his head toward the holding cells. "She wouldn't ID," Kessler said, and for the first time that night, his voice cracked with something like doubt. "You colossal idiot," Faulkner hissed, closing the distance between them until he was inches from Kessler's face. Read the bottom of the page. Kessler leaned in, squinting at the signature block. Executing Officer, Special Agent Renee Walker, Department of Justice, Office of the Inspector General, Anti-Corruption Task Force. Before the words had even finished landing, the station went silent. Not gradually, all at once. The hum of the air conditioning cut off mid-breath. Every radio on every belt in the bullpen died in the same instant, a chorus of static swallowed whole. "My radio just died," someone called from the corner desk. "Mine too," another voice answered, tight with the first real fear of the night. "Pruitt, check dispatch," Faulkner barked, and Pruitt spun to his bank of monitors, fingers hammering the keyboard uselessly against 4 frozen screens. Then, in perfect unison, all 4 went black and flared back to life with a single image. The Department of Justice seal over a solid blue field, a white progress bar, filling from 0 to 100 beneath it, and text that scrolled across the bottom in stark block letters. Network, sized under federal, 1 Kundal. Do not attempt reboot. We're locked out, Pruitt stammered. Phones, internet, radios, everything. Faulkner sprinted for the front doors and hit the panic bar with his shoulder. It didn't give an inch. The electromagnetic locks, run off the same server that had just gone dark, had sealed the building from the inside. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging the bullpen into 2 seconds of total darkness before the dim red glow of emergency lighting kicked on, washing the room in a color that looked uncomfortably like blood. In that red half-light, a phone began to ring. Not a cell phone. The old rotary unit on Faulkner's desk, the dedicated federal liaison line that had not rung once in the 6 years he'd sat behind that desk. He crossed the bullpen like he was wading through water and lifted the receiver with a hand that would not stop shaking. "Faulkner," he managed. "This is Supervisory Deputy Marshal Owen Traver," said a voice on the other end, flat and enormous with authority. "You and every officer in that building are currently surrounded. Your network is seized. Your doors are sealed." 4 minutes ago, Officer Grant Kessler destroyed a sealed federal warrant and unlawfully detained a federal agent in the performance of her duty. That is the triggering event. You have 90 seconds to lay every weapon on the floor and open your doors, or we breach, and anyone holding a firearm will be treated as an active threat. Do you understand? The line went dead before Faulkner could answer. He lowered the receiver slowly and looked out at his officers, at Kessler, standing frozen by the coffee machine with a cup shattered at his feet, at the red emergency light pooling like something spilled across the floor. In holding cell 2, Agent Renee Walker rose from the bench. She crossed to the bars, wrapped her fingers around the cold steel, and looked directly at Grant Kessler with an expression that was almost gentle. The building shook before they even heard the engines, a low-frequency hum, climbing up through the floorboards, the sound of heavy diesel armor idling in formation outside. "What is happening?" Kessler demanded, his voice finally cracking all the way through. "Who was that?" "Everyone listen to me," Faulkner roared, some last shred of command instinct fighting through the panic. "Guns on the floor. Now. Do it now, or you die in this room." The clatter of service weapons and magazines hitting linoleum was the only sound in the precinct for 4 full seconds. Then the front doors buckled inward with a boom that cracked plaster off the ceiling, buckled again and blew open entirely, and they came through the smoke in perfect formation. Not city SWAT, not anything local. Olive tactical gear and ballistic plates and U.S. Marshals stamped in yellow across 20 chests, rifles up, red laser dots sweeping the room until they converged, one by one, on the center of Grant Kessler's forehead. Hands laced behind your heads, a voice boomed through a megaphone. Down. Now. Every officer in the bullpen dropped. Through the wall of tactical gear walked a man built like something carved out of granite, a gold badge swinging on a chain against his vest. Supervisory Deputy Marshal Owen Traver crossed the room without hurry, snapped on a pair of black nitrile gloves, and lifted the torn envelope and its scattered pages off Pruitt's desk with something close to reverence. "Who?" Traver said, and his voice filled the entire room without him raising it at all. "Destroyed this document." Nobody spoke. Faulkner stared at the floor. "I won't ask twice," Traver said, sliding the torn pieces into a clear evidence bag. "It was Officer Kessler," Renee Walker said from the cell, her voice cutting clean through the silence. "He's kneeling by the coffee machine. The lasers found him in half a second." Kessler's throat worked, no sound coming out at first, and then a flood of it. "She wouldn't ID herself. She handed me this envelope with wax on it. People hand us fake papers all the time to beat tickets. I didn't know. It was a mistake." "A mistake," Traver repeated, crouching until his face was a foot from Kessler's. "Officer Kessler, you pulled over a vehicle deliberately routed into your patrol sector. You were handed a document sealed by a federal judge, and instead of following protocol, your ego led you to destroy it and false arrest an undercover federal agent. But here is what you still don't understand. We did not come here tonight for a torn envelope. We came because you, Captain Faulkner, and half this precinct have spent 4 years running an extortion operation on Route 14, shaking down freight drivers and laundering the take through a shell account in Delaware." Kessler's eyes went to Faulkner, who was staring at the floor like a man already sentenced. "Agent Walker has been auditing this precinct's financials for 6 months, Traver went on, straightening. "We had enough for an indictment. What we needed was proof of willful, deliberate crime, so the RICO charges would hold. So we sent her in with a sealed warrant into your sector on a night we knew you'd be working. And your arrogance did the rest." "You set me up," Kessler said, and something like rage tried to climb back into his voice. "I handed you an envelope," Renee Walker said, stepping out of the now unlocked cell, dusting off her blazer as if the last hour had been nothing more than an inconvenience. "Your ego did everything else. You couldn't stand the idea that someone you pulled over might have authority over you, and now obstruction of a federal investigation sits on top of every other charge you're about to face for the rest of your life." Marshal Traver turned to the room of kneeling officers, raising his voice for the body cameras recording every second of it. "Captain Roy Faulkner, Officer Grant Kessler, and all named individuals in this warrant, you are under federal arrest for racketeering, extortion, wire fraud, and destruction of federal evidence. As of this moment, you are no longer law enforcement. You are federal inmates." The sound of zip ties ratcheting shut and cuffs clicking closed filled the wrecked bullpen. Kessler was hauled to his feet and marched toward his own blown-open front doors. Past agents already tearing through desks and pulling hard drives, past the small folded triangle of red wax that had broken off the envelope and skittered under a filing cabinet where it would sit, unnoticed, for 3 more days. He had thought it was a traffic stop. It had been an execution, and he had tied the rope around his own neck with his own 2 hands. The interrogation room at the federal building downtown was nothing like the precinct. White walls, soundproofed, a steel table bolted to the floor and cold enough to sting through a shirt sleeve. Kessler sat cuffed to a ring in the table, staring at his own reflection in the one-way glass, and the swagger that had gotten him through 11 years on Route 14 had evaporated completely, replaced by the particular smell of a man who understood his life was finished. The door opened. Renee Walker came in without the blazer now, dressed in a dark sweater with a sidearm holstered at her hip, and dropped a thick manila folder on the table between them. For 3 full minutes she said nothing at all, just watched him, and the silence did more damage than any accusation could have. "I want a lawyer," Kessler finally croaked. "You already have one," she said. "A federal public defender named Carl Ossie. He's currently reading the 31-page indictment we drafted against you, and he's already told you to stay quiet. I think you and I both know that staying quiet only protects the men above you, men who are right now scrambling to figure out how to cut you loose before you sink with the ship." "I just wrote tickets," Kessler said, his voice thin now. "Faulkner told me where to patrol. I didn't know about any racket." She opened the folder and slid across an 8x10 photograph. Kessler out of uniform, in the shadow of a loading dock, taking a folded paper bag from a man in a grease-stained work jacket. "April the 11th, she said, her tone as level as a scale. "You took $9,000 in cash from a driver employed by Ironclad Freight Lines. 3,000 of it went into your personal checking account 4 days later. The rest went into a shell company registered in Delaware, managed by Captain Faulkner's brother-in-law. We have the bank records. We have the wiretaps. We have your dash cam pulling over freight trucks, disabling your body cam, and letting drivers pay you on the spot to avoid an impound. Faulkner made us do it," Kessler said, the words tumbling out now. "Ugly and desperate. Said if we didn't play ball, he'd put us on the worst beats in the city with no backup. Captain Faulkner is sitting 3 doors down from you right now," Walker said, tapping one finger on the table. "He isn't talking either. And he isn't scared of us, Officer Kessler. He's scared of the man he's been kicking money up to. A precinct captain doesn't run a multi-million-dollar operation on a state highway for 4 years without someone at the courthouse looking the other way. And whoever that someone is will make sure Faulkner has an accident before he ever sees a trial." "If I tell you who it is," Kessler whispered, "they'll kill me too." "If you don't tell me," she said, her eyes narrowing into something with no mercy left in it at all, "I will personally see to it that you're processed into general population at a federal penitentiary, wearing a reputation as a dirty cop who stole from a freight operation with organized crime ties. You will not last a month." "It wasn't just cash," Kessler said, and he was crying now, though he seemed not to notice. "Faulkner kept an insurance policy, a ledger, in case the man at the top ever decided to burn him. I don't know where. But Pruitt does." Pruitt was the one who made the drops. Back at the gutted Ninth District Precinct, forensic accountants swarmed the bullpen, prying open locked cabinets, bagging drives, cataloging every scrap of paper in the building. Agent Dale Foster, a methodical veteran of the department's Financial Crimes Division, ran his hands along the underside of Walt Pruitt's enormous oak desk on a tip relayed straight from Kessler's interrogation, and found, beneath a false panel, a vacuum-sealed bag holding a small leather notebook and a brass safety deposit key stamped with the logo of Cornerstone Trust Bank. Renee Walker flipped through the ledger under the harsh precinct lighting, and the scale of what she was looking at sank in one line at a time. It wasn't only freight extortion money. In the margins were names, city council members, business owners, and, circled in red ink on the final page, initials that made her blood go cold. B. C. $50,000 monthly. "District Attorney Bennett Coyle," she said aloud, and the room around her seemed to hold its breath. If the district attorney sat at the top of the pyramid, then every warrant this precinct had ever executed, every case this office had ever prosecuted, was suddenly poisoned. She called Marshal Traver immediately. Put Faulkner in solitary. No local corrections staff anywhere near him. This goes all the way up to the DA's office. We already have a problem. Traver's voice crackled back. Pruitt lawyered up an hour ago, and guess who walked in to represent him? Gordon Reyes, Coyle's personal fixer. Word's already out on the street that the precinct fell. Coyle knows we have Faulkner, and he's already moving to silence the weak links. Get me a federal seizure order for that safety deposit box, Walker said. Bypass the local courts entirely. If there's hard evidence behind this ledger, it's in that vault, and if Coyle's people get there first, we lose it. Half an hour later, 3 black SUVs pulled up outside Cornerstone Trust Bank downtown, and Walker crossed the marble lobby flashing federal credentials at a terrified branch manager who led her, flanked by marshals, down to the private vault level. The security guard posted outside the vault gate was slumped over his desk, unconscious. "Weapons up," Walker ordered, and they moved in tight formation past rows of steel boxes to find a man in a gray suit shoving folders and a duffel bag full of drives out of an open compartment. "Federal agents. Hands where I can see them," Walker shouted, and the man froze, turned, and revealed himself to be Trent Whitfield, Assistant District Attorney and Bennett Coyle's most trusted deputy, caught red-handed, trying to empty the very evidence Coyle's ledger had promised. Whitfield's arrest sent a tremor through the city's political establishment, but Walker knew it wasn't enough. He would fall on the sword for Coyle without blinking, and connecting the ledger directly to the district attorney in a courtroom required something more than a shell company and a set of initials. That night, inside the federal holding facility, Captain Faulkner paced his isolation cell like something caged and cornered. At 6 o'clock, a guard slid a tray through the slot, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, a small carton of milk, and something about the way the man lingered outside the door, watching, made every nerve in Faulkner's body scream. He looked up at the security camera, bolted in the corner. Its red recording light was dark. He backed away from the tray, just as the cell's block door slammed open and Marshal Traver, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for his size, seized the guard by his collar and drove him into the cinder block wall. Officer Lyle Duncan, a corrections officer on loan from the county, was pinned and cuffed inside of 10 seconds, and Renee Walker walked in behind Traver holding a tablet, its screen already lit with a wire transfer confirmation. $50,000 cleared into an offshore account in this man's wife's name 11 minutes ago, she told Faulkner through the bars. The authorization came from a private server inside District Attorney Bennett Coyle's home office. "He just tried to have you killed inside a federal building, Captain. He isn't trying to protect you. He's trying to bury you before you can talk." Faulkner stared at the tray of food he'd nearly eaten, then at the guard being dragged out in cuffs, and whatever loyalty he had left drained out of him and left something colder behind. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, and his voice had nothing left in it at all. An hour later, in a secured communications suite, Faulkner sat with a headset on while a federal tech team traced the line. They weren't calling Coyle's office. That would spook him. They were calling his private phone, a number Faulkner had memorized for emergencies only. It rang twice. "I told you never to call this line," a smooth, cultured voice answered. "Bennett." "It's Roy," Faulkner said, his fear-shaken voice pulled straight from the script Walker had built for him. "The feds have me isolated, but I've got a guard letting me use a burner. I heard you sent someone after me." A long silence stretched on the line. "I heard you lost the ledger," Coyle said finally. "I didn't lose anything," Faulkner said. "They hit the bank, but Whitfield grabbed the decoy box. The real drives. The ones with your offshore routing numbers, the councilman's photos. All of it. I buried them before any of this started. I'm not handing them over until you guarantee my family's safety and get me a lawyer who isn't going to sell me out." "Where?" Coyle asked, and something in his voice had shifted from contempt to desperation. "Pier 9, Locust Point, Container 1104, Faulkner said. "Combination's your birth year. You've got until midnight to get my family out of the city, or I hand the location straight to Agent Walker." The line went dead. Traver clapped a hand on Faulkner's shoulder, and Walker turned to him with a grim satisfaction. "He won't send anyone else this time. He can't trust another soul with this. If those drives are real, they're the only thing standing between him and a life sentence. He's coming himself." The fog off the Patapsco River that night was thick enough to taste, carrying diesel exhaust and the low, rhythmic clang of a channel buoy somewhere out in the dark. Pier 9 was a maze of stacked shipping containers, 5 high, and hidden among the rust-streaked canyons, 30 armed federal agents waited without a sound. A dark gray sedan crept onto the gravel lot, with its headlights off, and rolled to a stop in front of container 1104. District Attorney Bennett stepped out in an overcoat and leather shoes that sank immediately into the mud. A man who had spent a decade in courtrooms and country clubs, now stumbling through the wreckage of his own choices. He found the container, spun the combination lock, his birth year, exactly as promised, and pulled the door open with hands that would not stop shaking. The box was empty except for a single sheet of heavy parchment, sealed with the same Department of Justice emblem that had started all of it. Coyle picked it up and read, in bold red ink, a single line, 18 U.S.C. paragraph 1519, destruction of evidence. The exact crime that brought your empire down. Before he could fully understand what he was holding, the night erupted into blinding light. William Russo, Traver's voice boomed through a megaphone. "No, District Attorney Bennett Coyle. Keep your hands exactly where they are. You are surrounded by United States Marshals." Coyle threw his hands up against the glare, his spine hitting the cold steel of the container behind him, and tried, one last time, to summon the authority that had run this city for a decade. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he shouted, his voice cracking straight down the middle. "I am the District Attorney of this county. This is an illegal ambush." "You aren't walking into court as a lawyer anymore, Mr. Coyle," Renee Walker said, stepping out of the glare and stopping 5 feet away from him. "You're walking in as a defendant." "On what grounds?" he spat. "A phone call from a disgraced captain and nothing else. That's entrapment, and you know it." She pulled a small recorder from her jacket and pressed play, and Officer Duncan's own voice filled the shipyard, thin and shaking and unmistakable. "He told me to do it. Coyle's people wired 50 grand to my wife in the Caymans. Said if Faulkner ate that tray, my family would be set for life. I just had to make sure the camera stayed off." "We didn't just trap you with a phone call tonight, Bennett," Walker said, and there was nothing left in her voice but cold finality. "We used it to force you into motion, to confirm you believed evidence still existed that could end you. But the crime that will actually put you away for the rest of your life is the one you committed 3 hours ago, when you tried to have a federal witness murdered inside a federal facility." "I can give you the mayor," Coyle said, his voice collapsing into something desperate and small. "I can give you 3 state senators. I have records, offshore accounts, names. Give me immunity, and I will hand you the entire machine." "The Department of Justice does not negotiate with the man running the operation to catch the men beneath him," Walker said. "Marshal Traver, take him." 2 marshals spun Coyle around and drove him face first into the rusted side of the container, and the sharp, metallic click of the cuffs closing was the sound of a decade-long political empire coming apart at the seams in one damp, foggy hour on a dying pier. Across the city, in a cell with nothing in it but a thin mattress and a concrete ceiling, Grant Kessler heard the news filter down the block on a passing guard's portable radio. "Breaking news out of downtown Baltimore tonight. District Attorney Bennett Coyle has been arrested by federal marshals in a midnight raid on the city's waterfront, hours after the stunning federal takeover of the Ninth District Precinct. Sources indicate a sweeping racketeering indictment has been unsealed." Kessler sat up slowly on the thin mattress, and the full shape of what his ego had done finally settled over him like a weight he would never set down again. A multi-million-dollar extortion ring, a blackmail network reaching into the highest offices in the city. 4 years of quiet, careful corruption, unraveled completely, violently, in a single night, for one stupid, unforgivable reason. Because he could not let a black woman in a rusted Honda tell him no on a dark stretch of highway, and his pride had needed her to know exactly who was in charge. He put his face in his hands, and in the silence of that cell, the only sound left in his mind was the wet, tearing rip of thick paper splitting apart, over and over. A sound he understood, now he would be hearing for the rest of his life. 5 months later, the Ninth District Precinct reopened under new command, its walls repainted, its name quietly retired from every news broadcast that had once made it infamous. Captain Faulkner and Officer Kessler took plea agreements that spared them nothing meaningful. Decades of federal time stacked on top of one another, their names permanently attached to a case study taught in 3 different police academies about the cost of contempt. Bennett Coyle went to trial and lost, the ledger and the peer recording doing more damage in court than either of his expensive lawyers could undo, and the seat he had once controlled was filled in a special election by a young reform prosecutor who kept, framed on her office wall, a single photograph of a torn wax seal, recovered from beneath a filing cabinet 3 days after the raid. Sergeant Walt Pruitt, who had never taken a cent for himself, but had made every drop with his own hands, testified for the prosecution and served 18 months. He spent his first free morning in a diner 2 blocks from Cornerstone Trust Bank, and, when a young officer at the next table recognized him and asked, quietly, whether it had been worth it, the silence, the years of looking away, Pruitt only said that the worst part of complicity was never the punishment. It was realizing how long you had known and said nothing. Renee Walker stayed in Baltimore only long enough to close out the case files. On her last evening in the city, she drove the same stretch of Route 14 in an unmarked sedan, past the exact shoulder where a busted taillight had once given a man with a badge and no conscience the excuse he thought he needed. She slowed, out of some instinct she didn't examine too closely, and then kept driving, because the road, at least, didn't remember what had happened on it. And somewhere out past the tree line the city was already learning to breathe differently, one dismantled lie at a time. What began as a routine stop on a forgotten highway, born from nothing more than one man's need to prove he was the biggest thing on the road, ended up burning down a corruption network that had quietly ruled a city for the better part of a decade. It is a reminder that arrogance rarely announces itself as arrogance. It wears a badge. It wears a title. It hides behind procedure and paperwork and the assumption that some people simply do not have to be believed. And it only takes one person, calm enough to hold their ground and patient enough to let the truth do the talking, to prove that assumption wrong. Justice does not always arrive in a courtroom with cameras rolling. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a rusted Honda, on a night, when someone finally decides that respect is not optional.